Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of my series that I call Mastering Shutter Speed for Beginners. And in part 1 we covered what the shutter is, both electronic and mechanical. We also talked about how to set the shutter speeds in your camera using shutter priority mode and manual mode. And in part 2 we're going to go over the relationship that shutter speed has with light. How much light is the shutter speed actually letting onto the sensor? So let's get started. Now we've already talked about shutter speeds like 1/160th of a second, and we've also talked about very fast shutter speeds like 1/1000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second. And we've also discussed briefly about long shutter speeds like 4 seconds, 10 seconds, 60 seconds, etc. And what we need to understand is that relationship that those numbers have relative to light. So for example, how much more light does 1/30th of a second add to the exposure versus 1/60th of a second? This relationship is very important in the exposure triangle because it'll affect your aperture and ISO depending on the final exposure that you want to get. So let's take a look at some typical exposure numbers that you'll see in your camera and try to understand what this relationship is. So what we're looking at here is a subset of shutter speeds that's available on most cameras. And of course our digital cameras can pick any shutter speed in between, but this particular scale is indexed in terms of full stops. Now, all you need to know right now is that faster shutter speeds let in less light and slower shutter speeds let in more light. Thereby, your image will be brighter the slower the shutter speed and darker the faster the shutter speed. Now, I've mentioned that these shutter speeds are indexed in terms of full stops. What does that mean exactly? Well, a stop is doubling the light or cutting the light in half, or halving the light. So for example, if we start at 1/60th of a second and we double our shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, meaning we're leaving the shutter speed open twice as long, we're adding twice as much light. So this is plus 1 stop. If we do this again and go to 1/15th of a second, we multiply by 2 again, and we're now letting in 4 times as much light versus 1/60th of a second, and this would be plus 2 stops. And of course, 1/8, we multiply by 2 again, and we're letting in 8 times more light relative to 1/60th of a second, and this would be plus 3 stops. And of course, to cut the light in half, we would use half the shutter speed at 1/125th of a second. So this is half the light. So this would be minus 1 stop. At 1/250th of a second, this is 1/4 of the light because we cut 1/2 in half. So we're now at minus 2 stops. And we cut 1/4 in half at 1/500th of a second. So this is 1/8 the light, or minus 3 stops. Now it doesn't matter which shutter speed we start from when we're talking about stops. Like in this case, we started with 1/60th of a second, which would be our base exposure at 0. And then we're adding 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, or subtracting 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. However, let's say we started with a base exposure at 2 seconds, all the way at the other end of the scale, and we wanted to decrease the exposure by 2 stops. We would go minus 1, minus 2. So now, going from 2 seconds to a half a second decreases our exposure by negative 2 stops. And relatively speaking, we're letting in half as much light here, and we're letting in 1/4 the amount of light here. So now I just want to break and show you something on the camera where you can use this index in terms of full stops on your camera. So just like we saw in our last video, this camera is set to manual mode. We have a 2-second shutter speed, and we can ignore the aperture and ISO value. What I want you to look for is sort of a scale that should be in your display with like a plus minus 0 next to it or underneath it. And this is telling me that this is the base exposure set at 2 seconds with these aperture and ISO values. Now, if I wanted to decrease the exposure by 2 stops, just like I did in the slide, I would change my shutter speed to a half a second. So let me do that. And you can see that a half a second directly correlates to a negative 2 stops, just like I did on the slide. And then of course, conversely, if I wanted to increase the exposure by 2 stops, I'd have to use a longer shutter speed than 2 seconds. So let's go back to our 2-second base exposure and increase the exposure by 2 stops. So that would be 1, 2 stops. So you can see that we need an 8-second exposure to brighten our image by 2 stops, which is 4 times as much light. So I took the time to explain that because it's very important to understand the relationship between your shutter speed and how much light it's letting into the camera. And that light is always measured in terms of stops. And stops is consistent across the other 2 exposure variables for aperture and ISO. So when you want to increase the light to your camera by 1 stop, you would double your shutter speed from 1/60th of a second to 1/30th of a second. And if you want it increased by 2 stops, what? We go from 1/60th to 1/30th to 1/15th of a second. And that's also why I wanted to show you how to use the EV meter on your camera, because sometimes you're limited to the shutter speeds that you can use when you're taking an image. So say, for example, you wanted to use exactly 4 seconds for your exposure, but then the image would be too bright, right, by 2 stops. So you can now adjust your aperture or ISO to help you get the correct exposure. So let me show you that real quick and then we'll move on. So going back to our 2-second exposure, you can see that the camera is telling us that we have basically the correct exposure because our EV meter is at 0 or base exposure. But if I wanted to use exactly a 4-second exposure, now the camera is telling us that it's now 1 stop too bright. So the image may be too bright for us. And we can compensate for that using either aperture or ISO. So let's just do it using aperture in this case. All I'd have to do is increase the aperture to f5.6, which is 1 full stop on the aperture scale. And now you can see our EV meter is back to 0, telling us now that we have approximately the correct exposure. Now let me give you another example, but this time I'm going to change the ISO. So let's say I want to go to a 15-second exposure. I can change my ISO by 2 stops, like so. And you'll also notice there's an EV scale down here as well. So I can just reduce the ISO down back to where I got my EV scale back to 0. And you can see now that we have a proper exposure. So as you can see, when you want to use a very specific shutter speed, you can use other tools in your camera to help you get the right exposure using the EV meter so that you can adjust the aperture and or ISO to help you get that correct exposure. Now that was just a preview into another lesson that I'm building on exposure. So stay tuned and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see that. But for now, let's go back onto the topic of shutter speed. Now some of you may have noticed that when we go from 1/60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, this is actually not exactly half, right? Because half of 1/160th is actually what? 1/120. So why did they do this slight jump? Well, mainly it's so that it's easier to remember. Because when we go from 1/60th of a second to 1/125th, it's easier to double it to 1/250th, to 1/500th, to 1/1000th, to 1/2000th, and so on. So as I said before, shutter speed is really only one variable in the exposure triangle, where aperture and ISO would be the other 2 to help you get the correct exposure. But shutter speed has an effect on the image other than the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. It also has an impact on the kind of image that you'll be taking. For example, do you want a freeze action like in sports action or bird photography, birds in flight, or do you want to show motion like in waterfalls or seascape type photography? So let's take a look at shutter speeds relative to those aspects of photography. Now, when we're setting our shutter speed, we need to look at 2 different kinds of motion. The first one is the motion of the subject itself that we're taking a picture of. So this could be like a bird in flight, where we would probably use a very fast shutter speed, much faster than 1/500th of a second, to freeze the action or freeze the motion of the bird. And then if we're doing a seascape or waterfall, we're going to use much longer shutter speeds, like 1 or 2 seconds, maybe 20 seconds. But we're talking about the motion of the subject. Now, the second scale here is referring to the camera's motion or camera shake. And the faster the shutter speed that you use, the more likely you'll be able to handhold the camera without getting any camera shake or motion, so you can help get sharper images. versus the longer the shutter speed you use, the more likely you'll need to use a tripod to eliminate any camera motion shake that you would get if you were just hand holding it. Now for me, my hand holding ability is sadly right around 1/60th of a second. And if I'm drinking a lot of coffee, it's probably closer to 1/250th of a second. But I'm going to give you a rule of thumb that many photographers use to help eliminate camera shake when you're hand holding the camera. So first, let me show you what I mean by camera motion and camera shake. If you look at this image here that I took at 1/60th of a second handheld, this image is not sharp at all. It's got a little bit of motion blur or camera shake in it. So if we look at it closely and zoom in, you can see very clearly that there is a lot of camera shake here and motion blur. And these people are just sitting there still, not moving at all. And this image is just not sharp at all. And this is what I mean by camera shake or motion blur in your images. So if you notice your images aren't quite that sharp or they have obvious motion blur, it's most likely due to the fact that you're not using a fast enough shutter speed when you're hand holding, thereby getting this camera motion and shake. Now the rule of thumb to minimize or eliminate camera shake is often called the reciprocal rule. And all that means is to use at least 1 over the focal length for your shutter speed. So for example, if we're using a 50mm lens, we want to use at least 1/60th of a second. Now, why didn't I use 1/50th of a second, right? Because that would be technically 1 over the focal length. Well, I'm just rounding this to the nearest full stop on the shutter speed scale that I showed you earlier. So if we used a 100mm lens, instead of 1/100th of a second, I would use 1/125th of a second. I recommend you actually use faster shutter speeds than the standard reciprocal rule, because most of our cameras today are considered high resolution cameras. Even our crop sensor like Micro Four Thirds cameras are 20 megapixels. They have a very small pixel pitch, which technically makes them high resolution cameras as well. And also for long focal lengths, I wanted to show you a couple examples there. So a 50mm lens, what I recommend is using at least double the focal length for shutter speed. So it'd be 1/125th of a second for a 50mm lens. And for a 300mm lens, I would use 1/1000th. Again, not 1/600th of a second because I'm just rounding to the nearest full stop at 1/1000th of a second. So when we look at this image here of this bird, I was using a 600mm equivalent lens, and I used a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second, because what? 1 over 1200th of a second is not a standard stop on the scale. So that's why I rounded up to 1/2000th of a second. And as you can see, this image is tack sharp. I can see every little tiny feather, and I can see every little crease in the leaf, and so on. I virtually eliminated all camera shake from this image. And I've also, by default, also eliminated any motion blur by the subject that might be happening since the bird is just kind of sitting there. So hopefully now you understand the relationship between the shutter speed and the amount of light reaching the camera, and that is measured in terms of stops, and also how to use the EV meter to help you get the correct exposure by adjusting the other 2 variables in the exposure triangle, aperture and ISO. And also the relationship that shutter speed has in terms of motion, and that there's 2 kinds of motions, subject motion and camera motion or camera shake, and how to minimize or eliminate camera shake by using the reciprocal rule of 1 over the focal length, or as I recommend, 1 over double the focal length, to almost completely eliminate that camera shake that you might get in your images, so you can start taking sharper images. Now in part 3 of this lesson on mastering your shutter speed, we're going to concentrate more on subject motion and how we can use shutter speed for different types of photography like sports action, birds in flight, or long exposures for like seascapes and waterfalls. And I'm also going to show you some very creative uses for shutter speed like zoom bursts and empty cities and things like that. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future lessons, not only on shutter speed, but in other areas of photography for beginners. And if you like these kind of videos, hit the like button, or maybe consider buying me a coffee because it makes making these videos for me a lot easier. But either way, I appreciate you watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.